Luke, how we doing today, friends? We doing all right? It's good to see you. Seth, it's good to see you again. And Luke, my goodness, Luke, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm very well, Daniel, yourself.
I am doing very well. It's an honor to have you. I managed to finish planting all the grass seed that needs to go right over there. So that's quite good. So that's all down. And it's actually
Well
supposed to
done.
rain for the first time in Virginia for like forever. So the idea was to time it just so you could get it down before, and then it will help grow it. So I think we've succeeded. We will see. And Dimitri, good to have you. So that is done. I will go and we have a wedding this weekend, so we have one just about every weekend this time of year, which is good. That's what we want. So I will go and
Yeah.
get that ready. And Michael, good to see you. I enjoyed speaking about Hikikomori the other day with you and Paradise Lost. So we're set. And Luke, usually people just raise their hand when they want to speak. Often we just talk about whatever's on our minds. I will put you on the spot though, because I really enjoyed your parallax conversation with Andrew, and I'd love to hear just so everyone here, Seth, Michael, Dimitri, and people come in, as we talk throughout the day. I'd love to hear what you're thinking about regarding what you brought up in that conversation, or more generally, Luke, just on anything at all.
Okay. Well, thank you, Daniel, for putting me on the spot.
Absolutely. Anytime. Happy to do it, Luke.
it is 5 a.m. here in Australia, but very happy to be here. So thank you for inviting me. What is on my mind? Yes. Um, well, I suppose there has been this continual question for me around this medium of the internet and the digital age. Coming from a tech kind of background in the business of tech in data and everything else that I do, I feel as though it is one of those unseen things, very much like fish in water asking what water is, that we're all immersed into this electrical energy that sort of fuels everything, and as well as it fuels us. And we're just unaware of some of the impacts that this has on us when we're all immersed into this ocean of light that's constantly flowing through us. And there is certainly a sense, and certainly from the science and what Jeff had said many, many years ago, and my own experiences, is that there is a lot more to this medium in terms of how it impacts and affects human beings, particularly how we function, our consciousness, our mind, what is really moving through the internet and this space. And so really there is this question of how do we become more aware of this in a very tangible and practical way? Is there a way outside of the algorithmic approach that we all have to become more aware of it and to live with it? And also for me, is that how does this impact, for example, spirituality, the development of kind of being, how we transform, all of those sorts of things, which I think is relatively new for our species. And so it's a big question, lots of material there. I think it's the first time our species has tried to grapple with whatever this is. But I feel that the number one challenge is that we're all in it. We're all in it. And we don't see it because it's like out of mind or out of sight, out of mind. And yet there are potentially ways to become more sensitive to it and perceive it. So I might just sort of leave it there, but I think that's one of the challenges.
No, outstanding, Luke, and thank you. And especially to be here at 5 in the morning. You are a saint, so well done, sir. And no, I think I've been thinking a lot about that, and I really appreciated our conversation. I'll give it to Dimitri and then Seth here. I was just speaking with Michael, and I've been doing a lot of kind of research, and I'd studied it before, but I've just been revisiting with the Hikikomori phenomenon in Japan, which are young men that are never leaving their apartment. And what's very interesting about this is it seems to be spreading around the world. There are probably good reasons why it has happened in Japan. It's a shame-based culture versus a guilt-based culture. And of course, it's hard to imagine the Hikikomori occurring without technology, where you can, get food delivered, you have endless entertainment, et cetera, so forth. And one of the things that I think we're seeing more and more, in my opinion, is that socialization is not given. It's a muscle you have to train. And if you don't train it, it becomes harder to do. And something that Michael was bringing up is kind of this idea that the amount of time it takes to go from someone who's fully socialized and going out and you're good to go to someone who never leaves their apartment is actually a very small window. It does not take long to actually just not bother with it anymore. And in a funny way, if all people do is hurt one another, insult one another, make you uncomfortable, if you can just stay in your apartment and, get all the food and be pleasant, isn't there a kind of enlightenment goal there, right? In the past, if you could separate from society, isn't there a kind of enlightenment goal? And, but it seems very problematic. And of course, I'm tongue in cheek with that. But here's the thing. If we as a world cannot really show people why bother with people, because all that happens when they go out is it's hard and complicated and difficult, isn't it pretty rational just to stay in your apartment all the time? And then, of course, if the longer you take to socialize, the more you weaken your nervous system. And then when you go out, it's terrible because you've weakened your nervous system. Well, then it's rational. You said it's rational never to leave. Like the longer it takes, the more it just seems rational to stop trying. So you can see how this Hikikomori structure works, because I think often for human beings, the greatest threat is some sort of enclosure logic, some sort of logic that becomes A is A, it kind of encloses and keeps out otherness, if you will, the B. And again, and then I'll give it to Dimitri here, the Hikikomori for me is very, very interesting because it is evidence that socialization goes away, and the internet is what enables this, right? The internet would not enable, without the internet, it is hard to imagine the Hikikomori occurring, right? Well, this would be an example of the internet doing something to us that we may not realize it's doing to us. And I would argue that the Hikikomori is the extreme, but actually everyone is kind of on a gradient of that now, right? And there's a certain trajectory in that enclosure if you're not careful. Because it seems like a Hikikomori is not, and Michael brought up this point, it does not seem to be a quote-unquote mental illness so much as it is it's socialized. It's a social condition that does this. Well, if the internet does this, maybe because it's sucking all our energy, as you put it, and so we don't have the energy to go out and deal with other people, maybe we should get rid of the internet. But then I look at the internet as a social coordination mechanism, Randall Collins, network effects, and the potential that it could unlock. So how do we use the internet? And I'll just put it this way. And Daniel, good to see you, sir. Always a pleasure. More and more I've been thinking about how do we use the internet, of which weakens our nervous system, in a manner that doesn't destroy our capacity for socialization. Because if it kind of weakens our ability to handle otherness, then all its potential for otherness doesn't really matter. It's just going to be, it's never going to actually be realized. So I think there's much more to say. I think what you're getting at is a real concern. And thank you for being up at 5 in the morning, but I'll pass it to Dimitri here. Dimitri, it's good to see you, sir. And I hope school and everything is going well for you, sir.
Hi, yes, it's good to be here too. And as usual, we're immediately heading into the real topics, like the real core deep issues. And so I want to add something to the conversation, which is a lens I've been breaking my head on. And I think it starts with Descartes. It starts with Descartes and the difference in Descartes between the I and the I. So in Descartes, of course, he's known for the cogito ergo sum. But then he doesn't just say that the I is in the ego, which is just Greek for I, that is just our self-identity, the cogito. No, he says actually there is a res cogitans, which is the cogito as a thing, as a substantial thing. So we're not, Descartes, you could say, said not only subject, but also substance. That is what the I as qua ego, qua self-consciousness is. Okay, so before getting into the weeds of that, or I hope not too much, I think here we find the zero level difference between Noam Chomsky's cognitive linguistics and his theory of universal grammar, and on the other hand, Zizek's dialectical materialism. So for Zizek, subjectivity is feminine in its core and is the cogito. It's the abyssal knowledge of negativity, doubt as certitude. And then for Chomsky, it is the Cartesian scientific revolution that he calls the first cognitive revolution, the second one being in the 50s in America, of course. And so cognitivism comes from Descartes, right? The cogito. But it's not only the cogito, but the cogito as a res, as a thing. And so how do we see that back in Chomsky? Chomsky has this theory of universal grammar, and he's getting a lot of hatred for that because he's seen to be very much engulfing other languages and reducing them to maybe the logic of English. Now, Chomsky is, of course, well aware that this is quite a stupid misunderstanding of what he's trying to get at. So what is he actually trying to get at? Well, if Descartes was right that knowledge is innate and is not simply a miracle, but it is innate, then the res cogitans for Chomsky is basically empirically detectable in the natural substrate of language. In other words, you need a body to speak. And basically that body has a certain genetic code. And this genetic code, there's so little variety in each one of us of this genetic code that we all have the same universal faculty of language, which has a certain logic. And this logic, therefore, Chomsky argues, is necessarily universal because there's not enough genetic variety to be able for us to differ on this universal grammar. Now, of course, this universal grammar is also a generative, infinite, and creative grammar that's constantly innovating and incessantly changing for Chomsky. And how does this occur? Well, it occurs through what Aristotle called mechanism, or also what Descartes called mechanism, right? So Descartes was not concerned with the final cause as the goodness of God as the end-all be-all of existence, but no, it was about the how and why of existence in the very causality of basically empirical data, of formal logic, and these kinds of things. And so I do think that very much relates to the internet, and I'll give an example. So everyone at my study already knows this, but I just recently found out that there's what they call like a conlang community, which is like a constructed language community. And so there's like thousands of people, or probably way more, of course, that are all each creating their own language, like literally, like Tolkien, right? Like literally making their own language. And I mean, some people are like, you know what? I don't really like the nominative, accusative case marking system of English. So I want to have something more like Basque, or maybe something more like Hindi, but then also more pristine without irregularities. And then I'll have my own language. And I think like, it's like creating a world within oneself, right? And I can see like that being a kind of hikikomori thing, right? Like you lose to be able to have a language with others, so you'll build your own language from within, and you are God at that point, right? You are God. Like the rules, like you know the rules. Like of course, as soon as you write them down, you can make mistakes and people can correct you, but still you are the ultimate measure of that language. And oftentimes there's this sense to which the people who begin making a conlang or constructed language, they want to have it pristine, so they don't want to have irregularities. So that really shows from a psychoanalytic point of view that they want the sense of like imaginary self-sameness and a beautiful pristine system, right? Of course, then Kierkegaard would come along and say they built a beautiful, perfect castle and they live in a shack next to it, as Kierkegaard said when he was critiquing Hegel. And so I think there is this massive split on the internet, and I feel it with myself that you're this horrible body and it doesn't work and it hurts, and then you get on the internet and you can like build and like get this sense of like cleaning, like you can clean your desktop and get rid of all the files that you don't need, and you're like cleaning it up, right? And I feel like a lot of our activity amounts to cleaning. And here I'm very paranoid, and I'll give you an example. So sometimes when you have a conversation with someone, they'll all of a sudden like brush their hair, or maybe like do something like this, or just there will be like some garbage on the table and they just remove it, or they'll do whatever, and it's like a gesture of cleaning. But I think it's because they have a sense of dirtiness that they want to clean something. And so don't freak out, man. Don't take it personally. Well, you got your toothpick, so I mean that needs a whole another psychoanalytic session to flesh out. Maybe we can do that today. Who knows? But anyway, I feel like we're not, yeah, people want to get rid of the dirtiness, but humans are really disgusting and dirty, and I feel like this dirtiness itself can seem like a provocation, but then again, like if you want to have everything neat and clean and tidy, like you're going to be violent to others who don't really fit into that picture. That's really the problem with this imaginary self-sameness of the pristine system, right? Like I think Neoplatonism, like that's violence. I'm not into Neoplatonism. I think Neoplatonism is a denigration and degradation of the Platonist legacy. I would go as far to say that. I really stand by it. So thanks for letting me vocalize that.
Fantastic, and I'm very glad to be doing this in my garage. So, and I do keep my soul in my mouth. So you've got me on the psychoanalytical there. No, absolutely fantastic. And I had not thought on the idea of seeing Chomsky's universal grammar in terms of having something to do with the sharing of a body and some, et cetera, so forth. I find that very, very interesting because then, and I'll give it to Seth and Michael, is there a way in which if the internet is a certain extension of the body, kind of in a Michael McLuhan sort of way, then that is the creation of a kind of, is that the loss of the universal language then? Like if you get different information technologies, do you have different people that are actually following kind of different universal languages? It's an interesting thought. Like,
well, can I just
please?
He would never allow that. So he would say there is different parameters that people can choose, and like there's like choices of different language, like you can choose Swahili, Chinese, English, or Japanese, but it's just a matter of superficial differences. He literally says that it's just superficial differences. It's never to the core of our genetic logic of language.
Right. Which then, that's very fair. And I would wonder what he would say. Would CRISPR technology or genetic engineering or different things coming down change that? Or would Chomsky just be like, nah, man, that ain't gonna do nothing? But it's just very interesting. Rather, it's to the essence or the accidental on the idea at the very least. And I think you pointed at this very well. Even if technically it's not different, quote unquote, universal languages, in a sense, like you're saying, people can invent their languages, the Hikikomori on the internet, almost they become kind of enclosed in this sort of structure, right? That the internet affords that. And the question would be, how would you resist the temptation of using the technology to create an enclosure versus keeping open, right? Like, how would you actually maintain the discipline to do that, right? Especially when the internet is always presenting you with the temptation to be quote unquote clean or to get away from your dirty body or to, create something pristine. Like what would it mean to use, like it would require quite a lot of discipline, I suppose, to use a technology by which we could avoid the dirty, if you will, or the imperfect or the quote unquote real in a manner that does not do so, right? Like that would be very remarkable, but that seems to be what's required because when you have that logic of self-sameness, ultimately that does lead to the Hikikomori because the only way that you get actual self-sameness is total enclosure, right? And then once we do that, we should not expect, there won't be any political bodies, so politics won't really represent us. Technologically, we will be usurped, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's real stakes, and I really very much appreciate how you brought that into language. And what would it mean? Well, I guess this is the work of the poet in literature, right? In literature, there's a way of particularizing language without losing the universal, I almost want to say. Like in literature, you particularize language. You make it more your own. Like obviously Milton, because Michael, we were speaking about Paradise Lost, Milton is always in English, of course, but there's a way in which Milton's language is only Milton's language. Right, is a certain particularization. And yet, oddly, the way the literary writer does it is a manner that then becomes a book that you have to read, right? You're not even, there's some books that if you don't read, you're not educated, or it feels like you're missing something out. So it's very interesting to think of a certain use of language that leads to an enclosure of the Hikikomori, and a particular artistic use of language, I want to say, that leads to Shakespeare and Milton. And that difference seems important. Please, absolutely.
I wonder what you think of this, because I'm also thinking in the same direction. And I was thinking that actually creating your own language is kind of creating a universal theory of everything. It's structurally so homologous. But can this theory of everything interact with other theories of everything? Like this is the actual challenge, probably.
I think that is actually a fantastic question. And just to kind of touch on it for a minute, I think that gets into the question of what a literary conversation is. Like when you compare, like comparative literature, when I compare Cervantes and Shakespeare and Dante, like there's a way in which I'm dealing with various enclosed theories of everything, and yet I'm figuring out ways to make them relate. Right? And to me, that gets into, well, analogical reasoning, the ability to actually think in the metaxis, the between spaces, like the mastery of comparative literature. And then the other one is the mastery of translation. Like when you actually try to translate something, this is insane. Those kind of skills seem to actually be getting at things. It's a wonderful question, but let me give it to Seth here. Seth, it is wonderful to see you twice in one day. My luck is going up, my friend.
Yes, I feel the same way. Delightful to see you twice and to see everyone. Pleasure to virtually meet you, Luke. And I really appreciate the question you started off with. I kind of want to just restate it in my own way because it's something I think about all the time. And so I guess the frame, I always feel apologetic about this word because I think it's inadequate, but I use the frame of embodiment. So if I learn how my body works, and that could be a lifelong study, how does my body shift when I go in front of the screen, right? I think I want to make a plug for Michelle's wonderful video on the OG Rose channel this week called Being Online. And she talks about, hey, that doesn't necessarily mean being connected with Wi-Fi. It could mean you're online, like you're really here, like you're present, like your attention is online. And I love that she even went back and said in the radio days, we might have said you were tuned in, or you could actually just be attuned to what's going on without turning the radio on. But so this is interesting. But I do a lot of work with clients on Zoom, and I teach. I do a little bit of teaching in person, but during the pandemic, I went really online, and I kind of was a little bit of a blow when you said this, Daniel, because I felt it personally that we're all a little bit of a hikikomori. And I know I'm like kind of climbing out of a certain hole where I got very used to being online all the time. But at the same time, I would often go on Zoom calls where people would just sort of bemoan that, oh, it's not the same to be on Zoom. And of course, it's not the same to be on Zoom. When I got to go to Lynchburg and be with the Garner family, I mean, this is, I don't know how many times different than seeing you guys on Zoom. But we spend so much time online that it's like, well, what would it mean to be really embodied while I am connected to Wi-Fi? And putting aside like that maybe just too much screen is bad for us. But when I'm here, like when I show up at the net, or when I, talk to family, or I work with a client and I'm on a Zoom call, what does that mean? And, one of the things it means is that my eyes are always in convergence. It's just the way it is, right? Unless I go outside, our eyes can actually not really get much wider than parallel. But every time our eyes converge like this, which they always do with the screen, it does this to the body. This is where we go. So when you were asking the question, Luke, one of the people I thought of was the man formerly known as Peter Limburg, now Peter Limburger. But he's written a series of articles which he called The Pull. And it was basically like, oh, I can see my phone and I feel like I'm getting pulled. Like, you know, like if your phone is nearby and you just look at it right now, you can almost feel like, ooh, did I get an email? Did someone text me? Like, there's literally like, you know, you can feel that in your body. So he's done a lot of work on that. His articles are great. There's a crazy, I can't remember the name of the photographer, but Peter puts them in the articles where he's got this photographer created these photos where people's face is literally being sucked, like it's pulling their face off and it's going into the phone. They're really wild. But another thing, I mentioned it at the end of the conversation with Daniel and Aspasia just the other day is, and I think this relates to the Hikikomori and leaving the house and facing the other, is, you know, a lot of people, I think, today have a very beautiful idea in their head of, I want to be a better person, right? I'm working on myself. I'm doing development, self-development. And so one of the things that we talk about is do your inner work, right? Like if I'm being a jerk to myself inside my head all day, like be good for me to clean that up, right? And if I'm being a jerk to myself all day, and then I go and talk to someone else, what often happens is they're looking at me and I'm looking at me too, because I'm just mostly in here thinking what a jerk I am, even though like I'm sitting across from Michael or something like this. Like, you know, mainly I'm like talking to myself about my conversation with Michael, and Michael's getting like the leftovers or something, right? So we could say, I need to do my inner work first before, you know, I go out into the world. But you could do your inner work forever and say, I talk too much in my head, so I better never go, I better stop. Like, and so there's also a way that, I'll just use the phrase outer work. You could do your outer work. Bonita Roy did a lot for me in understanding this. She has, in fact, she has a meditation where it's very much about the eyes being wide. And what she points out is when the eyes are wide, and you can do this, like if you're ever walking in the woods, what you try to do is see both sides of the periphery as much as possible. And if you do that, you'll have an experience which scientific term is motion parallax. And that's the phenomenon that when I'm walking, it looks like the world is streaming past me, as opposed to, oh, the world's just this background movie set and I'm the animate living being, right? So David Abram, who's the author of The Spell of the Sensuous and Becoming Animal, he writes about this. But what Bonnie points out, so she invites people to do a meditation. You can do it outside or you can do it sitting in front of the window, but your eyes are wide like this. And if a bird flies through the window, the instruction is you do not follow the bird with the eyes. You do not chase. You just keep the eyes soft and wide and do not chase. That's basically the instruction. Soft, wide, do not chase. But what she talks about is this correlates to not chasing thoughts. And when she teaches the meditation, she'll get people into it and she'll just sort of like, you know, talk them through it and they get into the state. And then she'll pick someone and she'll say, I have a question for you. What day of the week is it? And the person will be like, Thursday. And she said, did you move your eyes? And people tend to move their eyes as they go looking for the answer to what day of the week it is. Some people don't, but the majority of people will. And so it's just a sort of a connection between the eyes and thinking or clearing thinking. I already mentioned this thing about, you know, the eyes being narrowed. So I think if we decide to go face the other, you know, I've got some hang up about this person I want to go talk to, and I'm always talking in my head, but I just decide, damn it, I'll just do it anyway. I go out of the house, I feel awkward, I'm trying to socialize. And actually, this is where Bonnie would say, if you notice yourself talking in your head while you're talking to the other person, take your eyes soft and wide. And when she taught this at a retreat that I went to, I did it at lunchtime, and it kept bringing me back to the conversation when I was sort of leaving the room while the person was talking to me. You know, like the person's talking, but you notice you stop hearing the words, you just see their lips moving, and you're like deep in this conversation. So I would use that. But yeah, we go out and maybe I am in my head. Maybe I do a little of that, but then I keep realizing the person is talking. And, oh, damn it, pay attention, Seth. You're socializing here, right? so I'm not ready. I haven't finished my inner work, but I'm doing the outer work anyways. In other words, I'm not being the Hikikomori. And Daniel, you said something recently that I love, that there's the inner world, and that's the world where potentially everything is comfortable and great. The outer world is anxiety, right? But if you sort of say, oh, anxiety is just what the world is, and I get to swim through it, but there's different flavors of anxiety, you know, some different colors of anxiety, like I can actually get interested. And then if I sort of acclimatize myself to a certain level of anxiety, it doesn't feel as much like anxiety, you know. And then the big thing that I've never experienced before happens, and then there's some fresh anxiety. But, you know, it's like, because the unknown, or I guess the lack, can suddenly loom large no matter how much inner work or outer work I've done. But the last, there's two other things I wanted to mention, because something in reference to what Dimitri raised, but just again, with how do we put the internet? So I was like, wait a minute, is the internet, is that the inside or the outside? Because I could be a Hikikomori at home, but the internet is like the world. And I mean, I don't know how many times I've thought, I wonder what's going on in the world. Let me pick up my phone and stare into the little screen with my eyes narrowed. It's like, oh, now I'm connected to the world, you know? And then it's like, wait a minute, I could put my phone down and go outside. Shit. I have no idea what's going, like, I haven't read the latest news, like, you know, like, or how many times I check the weather on my phone, like, before I just go down the 4 flights, because I'm on the 4th floor, you know, to see what the weather is, you know, like, oh, let me see if it's cold or hot. I'll check okay, oh, I'll put on my jacket, and then I go outside and it's, you know, I don't need a jacket or whatever. Just on, Dimitri, so this also hit me in the gut a little bit, because I'm a bit of a conlanger. I'm a bit of a, like, created my own language. So it's a musical language. It doesn't mean anything. It's basically like taking speaking in tongues into formal composition. So I created a syllabic phonetic language without meaning. And I've riffed on it. I was showing it grids of syllables to Daniel and Michelle and his kids when I visited. But what's really true about that is, when I got into it, I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. Like, there's so much here. And I thought there was especially so much here because there was no semantic level to it. So I was inspired by hearing people on the New York subway speaking languages I didn't understand. I was just hearing music, you know. And then I took a music class in college on world music, and I didn't learn to speak Chinese, but I learned about the 4 tones of Chinese and how they each changed, you know, the meaning. Like, a single word could be ah, or it could be ah, or it could be ah. And there's all of these are different meanings. And I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. But anyway, it was like, for me, I could spend my whole lifetime just going down this rabbit hole, right? And then, since I was a composer and a musician at that time, I thought, well, what I really, really, really want is a choir where everyone is fluent in my imaginary phonetic language. And I was pretty sure it would have been a badass, you know, group. And I did some experiments, but, like, I didn't have the wherewithal to do the social organization to convince a bunch of people this is a good idea, come to rehearsals, hang out. I kept, like, spinning inwards, you know, while I was trying to lead people into this process. They went a certain way with me, but I kept feeling like I was asking people to act like lunatics. You know, and people, that was sort of the feedback I would get. So it's kind of funny. Anyway, I'll leave that alone, but I also just want to hold up this book for a moment called Linguistic Bodies. And this is something I also learned about through Bonita Roy. You can find her on YouTube speaking with Ezekiel DePaulo. And Linguistic Bodies, and I think we can fold the internet in here as well, is he says we all have 4 kinds of bodies. We have an organic body. So that's the body that you need to feed, and it needs sleep and all of that. We have the sensory motor body, which is the one, you know, that has eyeballs and can feel stuff and, like, taste stuff and sees the world and, like, responds to sensory motor input. Then he says we have intersubjective bodies. And so this has to do with our relationality, but it's at the very base level. So it's like if you and I are coming towards each other in the hallway, and then like it's narrow and we have to move to the side and we do that little dance. It's like, that's the intersubjective body trying to figure out how we're gonna like actually, you know, get past each other. And then the final level, and I mean, this is a thick book, it's academic, it's a challenge to read, so I haven't fully gone through it, but the final level that he talks about is the linguistic body. And the basic thesis is your embodiment is the history of all the words you've ever spoken and heard, right? Like, so you think about just being here on the net and someone says something and it gives you an idea. It's like, that's language going into your body and like doing something to the body. And I think it's super powerful. I'm hoping one day maybe to reach out and see if I can invite him for a conversation on my channel. But anyway, you can find him on YouTube. He's a fascinating guy. But then I'm just thinking, and Ezekiel DePalo also has done work around AI, and I'm sure he's probably got plenty to say about the internet, which I haven't read. But in any case, you can think of the internet as just an explosion of like, how many words do you imbibe per day? I mean, if you're in New York City and you're not online, you're just going down the street, you're seeing all the signage, whatever. But having a device that's popping visual or sometimes audio with video language into your head all day, and it's just like, So, I mean, in any case, I think all of that is, let's just say I'm stressed out and I want to calm down. That is all of what I take into, let's say, my 15-minute meditation in the morning. All of that's in there, you know, including the fact that when I'm done meditating, often the first thing I do is check my email, you know. So it's like, I kind of say all this just for the sake of underlining the question that Luke started with. I just think it is such a fundamental question, and I think that the culture is only beginning to ask it. I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done by you know, people on the dangers, like what, you know, I have a 16-year-old daughter, think about what social media has done to young girls, young boys, pornography, all of that. But I think just in our everyday life, without like feeling like, you know, I'm fighting some crazy pathology or neurotic behavior, just as whatever it means to say an everyday normal person, there's so much about this context and what it means for me to be comfortable in my body that I think has only just begun to be considered. So again, I think this is a beautiful, beautiful question. So I'll pass it back from here.
Absolutely magnificent. I appreciate all that. And Kate, wonderful to see you. You know, first, I think, I love the examples of being involved. And you got to read Luke's book on Gertchev's Christianity. All the practices in it, and Luke's Seth's work on the musicality of being is completely invaluable. I very much appreciate all of that. I really love this question of, is the internet outside or inside? This feeling that you're out. That's a wonderful question. And it does make me think of the difference between tongues that are enclosure and like Pentecostal tongues that is connection with the divine, right? Like there's a way in which there's a form of tongues that is actually trying to almost universalize and have divine connections. And there's a form of tongues where you're actually trying to keep out the other, right? And it's interesting to think, so what exactly defines the difference between in and out? Well, for most, it may actually have more to do, well, for me, it has a lot to do with the presence of anxiety. Anxiety is the experience of something other and something you cannot bring entirely into your map. Therefore, it is scary. But in that very scariness, it could also be beauty, like God is Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses. It's Dante and Ancient One together based on your relation to it. And it is interesting to think that really perhaps the question, instead of using the language, oh, we need to get outside or we're inside too much, that may have been a better language for a non-technological age. But in an age today, it might be, are you getting enough doses of anxiety today? Are you strengthening your nervous system? Are you actually encountering otherness, or are you running from otherness? And I think that also relates to the tongues questions, because I think a lot of people are inventing their own language per se, precisely to keep out other or to make a world that they don't have to leave, as opposed to in Pentecostalism, you're doing it in front of the church and it's very anxiety producing, right? Or you're doing it with other people. So it's interesting to think how even in that example of tongues or you know, there's a difference between tongues to avoid anxiety and tongues to actually face anxiety, right? And it's interesting because when I was speaking with Luke on this idea that there's this energy, and the energy has to move. We cannot control it. We can direct it, we can channel it, but we cannot control it. And what often is actually occurring, it's almost, to me, when you avoid anxiety, then what you end up doing is enclosing, so you're not letting the energy flow. It becomes trapped. And so what ends up happening is there's an explosion, right? You have to have it flow. And also, if there's something about a globally connected world that needs to have a flow of energy, or else it gets captured and there's a blowing up, we actually need the energy we actually need the internet to sufficiently help the energy flow, because otherwise we don't have an infrastructure necessary to actually avoid explosions. It's going to get trapped inside of us. But we could also just use the internet to try to enclose the energy or to avoid the energy, right? So it's an interesting thing, because I think what we're also seeing with the social coordination, we've talked about it many times, the internet allows us to overcome various problems like the introduction problem. It allows us to overcome local knowledge problems. There's a lot of things that the internet does that is a very, very, very big deal. But there's a massive difference between using the internet to encounter the Gödel point or to create map consistency. And being aware of that difference is a very big deal. And if we're not aware of that difference, we're probably just going to, quote unquote, use the internet to be enclosed, right? So I very much appreciate it, because there's another form of avoiding the internet. You know, you could avoid the internet to actually be a hikikomori, right? Like you say, I just don't want to know what's going in the world. I don't know what's going on. I just want to focus on, you know, I want to be present. Like, you can have this language of presence and embodiment that's actually avoiding anxiety, right? And that's not good, right? So, and also too, the last thing, and then I'll give it to Michael and Daniel, is, you know, Michael brought up how we can think of, and I really like this, how we can think of the hikikomori as in a constant state of stage fright, like perpetually in stage fright. Like when they just go to the shopping mall, it feels like 700 people are watching them, right? And you actually see this now. If kids get a call instead of a text, they're overwhelmed with anxiety, right? So in a world without sociological givens, as we talk about in Belonging Again, people don't have direction, so everything feels like a performance that has to be improvised. And under those conditions, everyone can feel like that they're dealing with stage fright, actually. But if you learn to channel that anxiety, then you can, you know, be an outstanding athlete or an outstanding performer or someone who rises to the occasion. So anxiety is an opportunity for magnificence, or to give into a temptation of enclosure. There's more to say. I love all the examples you gave, but I will give it to Michael and then Daniel and then anyone else who likes to speak. Michael, it's good to see you, sir.
Good to see you too. Yeah, this has been a really fascinating discussion so far, and touching on a lot of things I've been thinking about. And Daniel, you just put your finger on a tension that I've really noticed for myself has kind of come to the fore since the assassination of Kirk, where there's this part of me that doesn't want to engage on the online space because it's very difficult to find discourse around it that isn't partisan or clearly very ideological. And you know, recognizing what that does to my nervous system, recognizing, you know, how that doesn't really pull me in deeper to, you know, connection with someone, whether it's someone I agree with or someone I disagree with. And so there's like one temptation to kind of just turn off the phone and just be like, all right, I'm going to continue engaging. And then, you know, most of the people in my life who I voluntarily engage with are people who are like having connective as opposed to divisive conversations. So it's like, all right, well, I'm not opposed to talking about this, but I'd want to talk about it in an arena with people who can, you know, like have a productive conversation. But then there's the other part of me that's like, this is such a high percentage of the population that's feeling, you know, this like very charged emotional response one way or another. And that could be my neighbor, that could be my housemate, that could be my colleague, that could be my supervisor. Hell, it could be part of me too. If I actually like listen to someone long enough and recognize the part in me that feels that emotionally about it. It might not compel me to, you know, speak in front of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people and do that. But insofar as I try and like insulate myself from that, like, is that actually affording deeper depths of self-understanding and understanding of the other, or can it actually prevent that? And so I think the internet is like the ultimate FOMO creating machine. Sorry, Daniel, I didn't time that right with that sip that you were taking. But there's there's always that feeling of, if I just have, you know, kind of a very romantic era kind of Hayao Miyazaki like kind of feeling morning where I'm just out in my backyard and I'm just noticing the birds on the trees and, you know, smelling the flowers and reading a book. There's like a beauty in that, but then at the end of it, I'm like, what did I miss in the world, right? Like, and there is like a feeling of kind of disconnection, even in that like feeling of embodied connection. And then you know, you go on Instagram and you see all the, you know, the things people are posting about the happenings of the day or the things that were sent to you, and then everyone around you having an opinion formed about something that you haven't engaged with, and then you kind of feel like the outsider. And so it's just interesting to notice how, you know, like these motivations that, you know, a lot of people like us have towards community, towards connection, towards belonging, right, can actually, in some spaces, be the very thing that makes you feel less of that. And you kind of almost feel, even in like a non-religious setting, you almost feel heretical for being like, well, I actually can empathize with both sides of the Kirk debate. You know, the people that say that his assassination was terrible. He was, you know, a loving husband. No one should get killed for simply speaking out and expressing opinion. And then the people who are like, well, there were things that he said that were very controversial and potentially harmful. You know, things that he said about like children being killed in schools being just a natural byproduct of the Second Amendment. It's like, you can argue that like indirectly or directly actually led to like perpetuation of violence. So, but to say that in a discussion with people who are either on one camp or the other can feel very alienating. You know, you can be judged for that. You can be called crazy, or you can be called kind of like indifferent. Like, oh, I don't have a hardline stance, and that means that I don't really care about this. And so, I think it's a real interesting balance, because Daniel, I was listening to, I think it was your most recent conversation with Aspasia and Seth, and you were talking about this at one point about like kind of using exposure to the internet as kind of like a pulse, like a pulse gathering opportunity on like what is the culture experiencing right now, what is the zeitgeist experiencing, and that, you know, even if the impression that you get at the end of that is like, oh, we're like we're in like mass hysteria. It's like, okay, like that's information too. But I go back and forth in knowing, like, is subjecting myself to that and it not being something that I feel, is that productive? Is that useful? Or, you know, is it just helping me, you know, be more sympathetic to someone? But is it really like in service of, you know, a real deepening of self? Or would it really only be, you know, would it really only be serviceable if that person were to be, you know, face to face and kind of like a you know, an active dialogue, as opposed to kind of passively taking that in? And the last thing I'll comment on before I pass it back, because I was also really fascinated by like the whole discussion around language and like creating your own languages, and the influence of, you know, the proliferation of language through the internet on us. And it's really interesting to notice too how certain words and phrases like evoke such depth to them, and you know, being introduced to a novel term which kind of creates kind of like a novel framing of something, can very literally, like on a physiological level, like change the way you navigate. I mean, like when I heard John Vervaeke's participatory knowing, or like the 4 P's of knowing for the first time, like the amount of like actions that influenced, I mean, it's kind of almost impossible to like drill it down, because I mean, I started like cooking my own food because I was like, I feel like I'm like just kind of, you know, passively engaging with like the whole process of engaging with food. And I want like a participatory understanding of like food science and like what things taste and how to combine them. And now I am literally working for a nonprofit that manages farmers markets, and like that was like directly tied to like, and you know, like ad infinitum, like things that concept has like changed in my life. So it's like language is, it's not just like pretty ideas that we like to throw around and, you know, feel nice to talk about. It's like they very literally influence our lives, and the question is like, you know, what are you letting influence you? But also I think an interesting question is like, in an age where we're, you know, it's like we're like absorbing all of the, you know, the words, and most of them are like cheeseburgers like being flung at our face instead of like, you know, vegetables rich in vitamins. Like, can we even metabolize words anymore? Like, can we even like allow them to like sit on our tongue and like actually metabolize and be digested and then be transformed into like new energy? Or have we become kind of such passive consumers of language that we don't really know how to sift through all of that and separate the wheat from the chaff? But I'll pass back.
No, magnificent. I'll give it to Daniel and Seth and anyone who else wants to speak. And Jacob Kashir, it's wonderful to have you here. I was just speaking with Javier on how I think very often we don't think of the free will determinism debate in terms of language. I think basically most terms in languages have a certain like bowling alley gutter. And you see it with the Kirk situation. If I say Kirk was a father, then it has a certain trajectory to the discussion. If I say that Kirk was a pundit, there's a trajectory, and there's a kind of determinism that the language itself sort of sets up. One of the reasons philosophers are constantly making new terms, or they're making differences between love and like, or differences between, say, murder and killing, I could go on, or making new terms, is because these are actually literally acts of agency. You are creating, it's a way of freedom, actually, so that you're not just carried along by things. It makes me think of Gurdjieff on being asleep, being conscious, right? If you don't actually ever get into the work of inventing language, you are practically asleep because the words themselves have a certain trajectory to it. And I certainly, everyone suggests Luke's book on Gurdjieff's Christianity. It's been very helpful for me. And also I'm just thinking about this energy flow, because if we don't keep the energy flowing, it blows up. And that also, what you could say too with this, is that when you're unable to create new language or new terms, then the energy gets trapped. It gets trapped in a certain script. It's not flowing anymore. It seems like it's moving because you're communicating with someone, but actually, in a sense, you're not communicating. You're just going through scripts. So there's kind of a lack of development, and eventually that blows up. So when the discourse, what we see politically now is a kind of discourse that really is very predictable in a sense, right? There's a kind of algorithm, even to how people are speaking with one another. It's kind of predictable, the direction things would go over time, right? I think one could argue that this is not actually a flow of information. It's a capture of information. It's a simulacra of movement, and that's why it kind of blows up. But what the philosopher is trying to do, and the artist, and I'd say the religious as well, is actually trying to create agency through the subject by not being under the tyranny of words, right? And of course, there's a long tradition of God speaks creation. The subject is formed by language, like the formation of the person and language are strongly tied together, and the ability to create new terms. Because here's something that happens in the moment I say there's a difference between love and like. I'm suspending the possibility that language is reducible to definition. You have to hold open a space and wait for me to fill in what I mean by that distinction. But how is that possible? Well, that means intelligibility can operate in a space of not knowing until it is given a kind of framework, and then it can know and then progress, right? So there's a moment of a negation that then affords new possibility, but it happens so quick. Like agency is so quick, like, because then it's on a new kind of path, right? But that new path is a product of an act of agency freeing you from the scripts of language. So even if that path has a certain trajectory, which it must, or it would be chaos, so it has to be a kind of form, then this actually becomes a testament to a development of agency and a new directionality of the energy and the subject. So it's very important to do that. And I suppose what we're seeing, I have many more notes, but I'll give it to Daniel, is that the internet allows a certain acceleration of the trajectory of language, or a spread of the possibility of the freedom from language, the ability to split apart and have new terms, right? Because now we can see online on the social coordination mechanism, here, net, John Vervaeke, et cetera, so forth, you see models or people who are using language in a manner where they're opening it, 4 Ps, creating new terms. So you're seeing models of agency. Well, before the internet, you just had to be lucky and go to a diner where somebody was doing that. What are the chances of that, right? But now you can see this modeled. Everyone can see it modeled, and everyone can also then feel permission to do it themselves because they see other people doing it, right? So this increases consciousness in the being awake in the Gurdjieff sense. But at the same time the internet does that, it also accelerates the rate by which the scripts embedded, the scripts and trajectory in unconscious language is realized. And in a sense, that's actually, in one way, that's good. Because as it accelerates, it becomes more visible that it actually does that. The internet makes this very visible that this is occurring, right? And Dimitri, always great to have you, sir. Thank you for coming. And in that way, it's good. Because now you could argue this was actually always happening, but it wasn't so fast and visible and obvious that you could be not aware that it was occurring, right? So you actually have a way now to see this way that information gets captured in a discourse and it accelerates, that if you use the internet to see that occurring, that's very beneficial. But the very act of seeing it could mean you get swept up in it, right? And I think that speaks a bit to the tension that Michael is speaking of what is the right amount to be informed, to see the trajectory, to be aware of it so you don't get caught up in it without yourself getting caught up in it, right? Like, what is the right degree by which you can, and I think that's it's very funny you bring that up, Michael, because Michelle and I were just talking about that, because I myself can feel like you're watching the news and how it just, there can come a certain enjoyment from seeing the rage of people at current events, right? Like you see that they're mad and there's actually a kind of liaisons that comes from that, and it leads one thing to the next, and you can kind of feel, I do think that intuition of feeling the pull is part of it. When you start to feel your face going into the screen and you can intuit that's occurring, that's just get out, right? But you have to intuit that. There's more to say, but I will give it to Daniel and then back to Seth, and if anyone wants to speak. Daniel, please.
Epic. It's good to see you all. This the 4Ps, the incredibly potent idea and very simple. And so like has this intense proliferation kind of capacity, which I think is very useful. But Dimitri uses 4Ps. I know he dropped out, but he calls it a pee pee poo poo. Sorry, but I mean, I'm sitting here and I'm like, I'm feeling quite a calm. Like there's a real sense of calmness, and then I'm wondering like if I'm lacking that anxious edge, you know, like you want that edge because then it feels like something's happening. And in that calmness, what I'm more drawn to is like a kind of a reflective space, and then also something that the word like wondering would be appropriate to, like wondering. And it's immediately the stuff that would otherwise be concealed by something more like forward moving. So it's like quite reflective, and the conversation is also being of that nature. Like Daniel, you just ended there with like the reflecting on the very devices that we're using in order to engage one another. And I think there's like a 3-continent representation here, which is it's wild that we're conversing in this way through this medium. I was listening today. I went back to the Integral Stage has a series, Future Faces of Spirit, and I was listening to Bruce Elderman's introduction to that series, and he recorded it when I think it was released in 2020. So when the lockdown was happening, so he threaded that into his introduction to the. But I was listening to this, it was like a historical artifact now, like the time between that lockdown period and now. It was a really interesting reflective moment to see what the concerns that he raised were, and because Bruce is so impressive, he managed to thread that like the immediate response to the moment with firmer or more wide-ranging principles to introduce the series at large, which that balance is really interesting and difficult in one's own writing and thinking, and like how to be responsive to the moment, but how to speak to more lasting and kind of general principles. So it's probably not by chance that Bruce also experimented in the production of his own language. I think I've heard him say that he was motivated to create a language that emphasized the adverbial or the process. Like he tried to remove as many nounal. I think he just tried to remove nouns from the language so that the expression was always this like something active. And he's spoken about that attempt, and I mean his studies with the grammatology and the like. I guess I'm appreciating Bruce Alderman right now. I wanted to. There's a few things I just like ping on, because a very interesting conversation and inputs, and again it's a lovely calm environment that I'm feeling, like this reflective space. There's a culture that I've been tracking maybe for I think Seth would probably have the closest contact to it for at least 10 years. I became aware of it through this figure Ido Portal. He's an Israeli guy. I think Seth, you have the Feldenkrais method. You have a contact there. I think Feldenkrais was also Israeli. But this figure Ido Portal and the movement culture generally that he's been a centrifugal force in producing, like watching this culture develop online, and the way that it exists as a culture online, and it like the whole thing is movement. So the expression and what gets recorded and then shared through the culture is bodies moving. But I mean that, like, I think initially it really proliferated through Instagram. But the people who really get into this, they commit their lives to it. And Ido Portal himself is a central figure with like long-standing students of 10 years plus. So like someone who's motivating real discipleship, who's at the real generative center of a culture, and a culture that's distributing such that it can be called a culture. It's not just centered on this figure. But there's been this like real revolution almost in movement study that he's been a part of, that Seth is a part of, with his musicality of being, this emerging field, or I've been using the word culture. I think for us that might be interesting insofar as we are participating in a culture, or generating a culture. Like our tendency here, or there's a strong emphasis and practice on language and coming to speech, and we elaborate on the embodied necessity of that, necessarily speaking from a body, but also the prior emotive and bodily work that sometimes it takes to come to speech about certain things in a way that doesn't get captured, or isn't reactive, or it's very difficult to speak in such a way that you're speaking then from heart and mind, and you're almost at the tip of your tongue. And now what if you expose yourself and you expose your position on a political subject that is now fraught in the wide, and then what if it gets seen by someone and then it's recorded, and like these kind of this does a particular working through the nervous system, that maybe that was what I was looking for. Like this, no, I must remember that there is an edge here. You have to be on point, but it's really difficult because I'm in my blanket and I'm in my comfortable place, and like I'm in my room, I'm inside, but I'm so outward facing that I'm interfacing with people in 4 different countries at the moment. None of you I've met in the flesh, but I feel really connected to each of you, and like we're doing something here, and it's pretty nuts. I think, yeah, there's one more point here, but maybe leave it at that. We can come back to it. I guess thinking about this, the last thing, and it's on this theme of the wondering and the reflection. It's like I think I'm feeling the value of this right now in terms of like really recognizing the strangeness and the affordance of what I'm immediately involved in. And something that I always overestimate, or underestimate rather, is just the proximity of knowledge sources, or languages, or philosophers, and that I become the person that compares them just by engaging them. Like this multiplicity of inputs is just wild. Like it really is crazy. The information that I can come into contact with on a daily basis. Okay, then here's where it can tie it and link it to the movement culture. I think it then becomes so important to think something like the practice or the ethic of something like pedagogy or learning. Like how does one hold oneself in a learning process in this kind of informational space? Because it can happen in such a way that it passes through you, but it doesn't touch you. You don't digest it. So then what is the ethic? What is the, I mean, and we would each have a lot to contribute to this, but how is it that you make of this contact a learning, a notebook? What kind of schedule? What kind of regularity? Like how is it that you actually digest what's so widely and disorientatedly available? And so appreciating this as part of my own learning process. Let me pass it back here.
No, absolutely magnificent. I very much appreciate it. I'll give it to Seth and anyone else who wants to speak. And Mr. Jock and Javier, Kate, wonderful to have you. I hope you're well. And no, so a few things. First off, I should note, like on this idea of, I think the problem, it is not going to work to say anxiety is good, therefore seek it. Because then in a way, you're not anxious about anxiety, actually. It's a stable state. It's the fear of anxiety, the avoidance of anxiety that tends to lead to this kind of enclosure of energy that then blows up. I mean, also, you could say getting on a Zoom call with people on 4 different continents, having no idea what you're going to talk about or what's going to come up can be very anxious producing, right? And actually, but if you do it enough and you train that muscle, it gets to the point where it doesn't actually create anxiety. And I think that's alluding to the kind of education that is needed, right? Like, what is an education? Because I also think to Luke's work on Gurdjieff is that without if all this information, all this energy is passing through you and you can't digest it, then you can't direct it. And so there's a way in which it's not flowing, actually. It's bulldozering you over, or you're getting lost in it. And probably what ends up happening is, since everything tends toward enclosure, if it is not with agency and awakeness directed, what will occur is that you'll just get caught up in however the energy is enclosing, and then when it eventually blows up, you'll blow up too, right? So the ability to metabolize and to direct, ergo to develop a certain agency, is very, very important. But how do you metabolize, basically infinite information of infinite complexity at all hours of the day, right? That seems kind of impossible. Well, this is where I think, a metaphor I always like to use that Mr. Jacob Kashir has also talked about with the hip-hop cipher. The hip-hop cipher is basically, I think, the model of education you need today, where you don't know what's going to be said, you digest it, you respond, you're able to improv, you're able to keep it alive. As my beloved Bernard Hankins would say, our age requires a certain cipher mentality, the kind of mind of the hip-hop artist, the improv comedian, where you're able to work with and flow with, but one will only be able to do that if they have the virtue and health that Mr. Jockin is teaching on in order to handle that and to work with it. Otherwise, you can't digest it, right? And basically, in order for the internet to, I think, be, and Luke has written incredibly well on Gurdjieff and the internet, and he was speaking just at Parallax about it, I think that does look like the hip-hop cipher. It has a very much, and what an education has to reflect that of what makes one capable of the quote-unquote hip-hop cipher. And of course, many people who do hip-hop in this sense will almost refer to it in religious terms and having a sort of spirit, etc., so forth. And of course, as Jacob has pointed out, the hip-hop cipher, dialogos, Behncke has come up, also go together. We can think of Guy circling. We can say, and then, of course, the other key to, I think, all of this. Oh, and I also I think Michael said, internet is ultimate FOMO machine. Absolutely. Absolutely. So how do you make sure that FOMO is fear of missing out on being human versus fear of missing out on being informed, and then you're anxious when people are talking about something and you're not in the in crowd, right? So, but I really much like that. Wittgenstein famously says that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. I would like to argue that the limits of your language are the limits of your body. And so the limits of your world are tied to the limits of your body. And then, of course, what's in the world? Your body. So the body is actually the linchpin between the limits of the world and the limits of the language, of which then makes possible the feedback loop. And this gets into the things like the practices that Luke talks about in his work, Seth is talking about. And I'm going to try the thing with the eyes that Bonita Roy is talking about. That's pretty freaking cool. I really like that. But I will pause and I will give it to Seth. And if anyone has anything else to say on this fine evening, Seth.
Yeah, if you want, I'll send you a recording. I've created a teaching on that'll guide you through that. Yeah, this is a great discussion, and I love that paradox that Daniel C is talking about, where why do I feel so calm here while all of these streams of craziness are coming from every direction? But yeah, I mean, maybe it's what Daniel G just said about, well, actually, we are doing that all day, but maybe there's a way that, I think the net has this simultaneity of coherence. Actually, could I say that? Of coherence and correspondence to some degree, which I've heard you talk about, Daniel, how often you have one and not the other. But yeah, well, okay, there's a couple things. I think I'll go in reverse sort of what I thought, just in honor of Luke being here, and I would love to learn more. about Gurdjieff, but what I know is through Feldenkrais, who is deeply influenced by Gurdjieff. And I don't know, Luke, if you have anything. I mean, if you know about that connection, I'd love to talk to you more about it. But there's a particular thing that Gurdjieff did that Feldenkrais directly grabbed and used in some of his trainings, which is apparently Gurdjieff would have people doing I don't know what, but then he would just yell, "Stop." And the instruction was, you have to be, whatever you're doing, you have to be like capable of coming to a total rest. And then, so Feldenkrais did this in movement, and he would teach a lesson where you're rolling left and rolling right. But then in the training, he would just, people would be rolling around and then he'd go, "Stop." And he'd actually yell like really loud, kind of obnoxiously. And if you were rolling to the left and you weren't all the way on your side, you're supposed to stop halfway onto the left side. And then he called this, and the principle was reversibility, that you never have so much momentum that you can't. And I was telling Daniel earlier today, his definition of good posture is, I can move in any direction at any time without preparation or hesitation. Now, of course, if you jump out a window or if you're sprinting, you can't instantly stop. But the basic principle, and when you teach a Feldenkrais class, the basic tempo of everything is super slow. So if you're rolling slowly, you actually can practice reversibility, even though after class, when you go out into the world. So it's a kind of almost an abstraction of everyday movement, because it's this special container where everything's in slow motion. But he would do that as a way of saying, and he would say you should be able to be emotionally reversible, psychologically reversible. He talks about, if you're having sex and get interrupted, you should be able to just pick up where you left off after the interruption. Like this was how Feldenkrais talked about this. And another thing which I suspect he may well have been influenced by Gurdjieff. And again, my actual knowledge of Gurdjieff is very superficial, but I'm just intuiting this, is he liked to get people to study their patterns. So you just have a person turn their head to the left, but do it super slowly, do it 25 times. Oh, did your chin move away from your chest or towards your chest? Which eye were you making more use of? Like, there's a zillion details when you just do the smallest movements that you don't notice. So you'd have a person study their pattern, and then they find out, oh, when I turn to the left, I'm actually kind of looking up. And you'd go, great. Now we're going to turn to the left and look down. And as soon as you do it, you realize, oh, my body is not primed for that movement. Looking up to the left is just like, it's just written into me. I mean, whether it's, this could be for a million reasons, but like if I'm a baby in my cradle and mother always comes into the room on my right, because that's where the door is, then as an infant, I'm turning to the right to see mother, right? Over and over. That's going to be deeply written into my adult embodiment and possibly my psychology and all of this stuff. But so what he would always do is say, what is the non-habitual movement? And he'd say, it's going to be awkward, so we're going to slow it down. It might be awkward enough that if you do it quickly, you'll hurt yourself. So we're gonna maybe even do a fraction of the movement. We're just going to do the first. But he saw going to the non-habitual pattern. I mean, here I am on the net. I've never thought of it this way, but it's kind of like the girdle. What's the girdle point in your movement patterns? And he would take you there. And I mean, it can, people try Feldenkrais. My experience of the first Feldenkrais practice I did, at the end, I was like, I didn't know it was possible for my body to feel this good. What just happened? Like, I couldn't understand it. And people have that response to Feldenkrais because it's really dealing with neuroplasticity through messing with the movement patterns. But of course, your brain is intimately involved in what your muscles and your joints are up to. So he's doing that. And just to kind of move into, so yes, Ido Portal is from Israel and definitely knew about the work of Feldenkrais, and he studied all kinds of other movements, but I know he respected Feldenkrais. I don't think he respects so much the profession of the Feldenkrais method, and there's good reasons. That's another whole discussion about what's happened since Feldenkrais died and how the legacy was carried on or not carried on, perhaps. But there's one of my trainers talked about not so much Ido Portal, but like the phenomenon of parkour, where people are like in urban landscapes, just treating it, like you can climb a tree. Can you climb a skyscraper? Like let's just find out what we can do. Let's treat the urban environment like a jungle. Or if you just go watch viral videos, I think there's something, I can't remember, but there's a particular viral video channel out there that shows you amazing movement. And if you watch, I mean, you've got how fast can a human being run a mile, and it keeps getting faster and faster, but also like you watch gymnasts do, you know, flips and twists that have never been done before. Like human movement is still evolving. And this too, because of the internet, like so movement culture, which is the name that Ido Portal coined online, has actually accelerated, like I would say, the potential of the human body. So people look at screens, but then they go and like see if they can climb skyscrapers. I mean, there's also, you know, kids who've been falling off of skyscrapers and like, you know, like there's all kinds of, it's nuts, but that's all there. Okay, so then the other thing I wanted to speak to was what Michael raised about, yeah, I really want to engage. I really want to talk about what's going on, but oh shit, you know, like most of the times I do that, it's like I get all this blowback. Maybe it'd just be easier to like hang out at somewhere like the net where, you know, people are prepared for the depth or whatever. But yeah, that can be kind of avoidance too. And Daniel knows this. I had an experience this week coming out of the discussion with Daniel Esposito where we talked about Erica Kirk, and you know, she said, "I forgive the killer," and I was like, "Damn," you know. And so I made a post about it. Basically, I said I thought that was beautiful, and I took a shot off the internet where she's looking up. Basically, in my mind, she's looking to God. She keeps looking up while she's trying to deliver this speech. Is Erica Kirk very aligned with MAGA and Trump? Yes, she is. But I attempted in my post to say, let's put that aside. Me saying, let's put that aside was like, everyone was like, you can't put that aside. And, you know, just like, anyway, I got all kinds of responses. I got some people who were like, actually, that's cool. Yeah, forgiveness. This is amazing. I love that, you know, you're celebrating that, but other people are like, what are you doing? You know, like this is, you are enabling fascism is what you're doing with your post. Like that was what people told me. And what I'll say about it is, once I got, and so I got like 90 comments like this, like, and I've been barely on social media. I put this up, I'm like, and also one other thing about the internet, which you can do, is you can write a post and then you can edit it, and you can edit it some more, or you can make a video and then, nah, that's no good, I'm going to re-record it, right? But I just sort of wrote this post and sent it, right? Like, and I made a video on the Charlie Kirk situation recently, and likewise, I was like, I'd better not overthink this, you know. But that too is a weird kind of thing. Like, I think it's perfectly valid to make a post, reread it, and go, oh, that's not ready to put on the internet. And you do, you know, like, but it's, what do? You make a different decision. But I will say that, I mean, this for me was a version of facing the other, even though it's actually online. And I learned a lot about how I could be more skillful next time. Like, I didn't really edit that post, but if I could rewrite it today, even without like adding a bunch of new stuff, just little phrases. Like I had some phrase about the only way to see this. And like my 16-year-old daughter read it later and she's like, that's how you talk to me, Dad. You tell me the only way. And I was like, oh God, okay, you're right. You know, so I had to, but it, and this is, so the specific thing that Michael was saying is you can be attacked. The phrase they often will throw at you is, oh, that's both sidesism. So you can have this intention to try to, hey, let's not play the us versus game, us versus them game. Let's see what's good over here. Let's see what's good over there. And the responses you can get is, well, but one side actually is evil and other side is good. And you're trying to make, you know, you can't do that. And it's like, well, maybe it's more nuanced than that. Like Dana was saying, there's plenty of good and evil to go around on both sides. I love that. That was with Esposito. But all I can say is that there was experience, part of the experience kind of sucked for me, but the way it sucked was really informative. And then like, I just knew I probably wasn't as eloquent as I could have been. Some people here, I just feel like they're just not ready to understand today where I'm coming from or whatever. Maybe they're smart, maybe they're good people, but like there's just no other way they were gonna. But it was good for me to get that experience because, like, frankly, although I don't love blowback, if I can't deal with blowback, then I'm just gonna keep my mouth shut, you know. So anyway, it was just it was really informative experience, and it was even though I'm typing words and I'm sharing ideas, the experience I had was in the body, because every one of these comments that was coming at me was like, oh, okay, oh, damn it, you know, and my heartbeat was changing, my breathing, you know, it was all in the body in that sense. Anyway, I'll stop.
No, I think that's magnificent. Thank you for sharing all of that. I'll give it to Michael, Mr. Jochen, and Mr. Kashir. Just a few things. Before I forget, I did want to comment, you know, on this idea of inventing language. One of the most important things, like, I started using like non-rational versus irrational, putting parentheses around terms, dashes, and different things. And that was a really big deal for me because I think agency is developed a lot in freedom from language. I think when you learn a second language, you can translate, you go back to the original text. Like Jochen will stress, there's all something about this that is increasing agency. And actually it was a really big moment because I turned in a paper to William Wilson that had a lot of dashes or made up words like non-rational or like good / bad, kind of using it together. And he actually upgraded me because of it. Like he could have downgraded me and be like, right, it's all nonsense, shoot. But actually that was a really big deal. And I think learning poetry and literature is actually increasing human agency by freeing you from the trajectory and gutters of words, as I spoke with Mr. Rivera. To what you were saying, it was actually funny. As you were speaking, I was thinking about on this idea of posture, the ability to basically move in any direction at a moment's notice. We don't, as a society, have good posture and ideas in language, do we? We can't suddenly move in a new direction of our ideas. If we're conservative, we can't change and take the liberal position, or as a liberal, change and take the conservative position, or be able to see Erica Kirk and take the other position. We don't have good posture as a society, and so we're not able to move in different directions at a moment's notice. Therefore, we're mostly determined as opposed to free. Because we don't have good posture in our minds, because we don't have health and virtue in the way that Jochen stresses, or this flexibility of being. I also will note that the hip-hop cipher teaches you flexibility of language, ergo you develop agency, the form. All of these, it is not by chance that, in my opinion, many of the individuals that are philosophically, theologically, etc., creatively inclined, have engaged in practices that make language something they use more than be used by. But they also respect language. There's a fine line between you accept the master in order to be free of tyranny, right? And the artist, the hip hop artist, the translator, like all of these things are a certain sort of respect of language. But then I think the key also, though, is you actually can't respect language in this way unless you train the body. Like it takes a lot. You have to face stage fright to do the hip hop cipher, to get on stage. There is training of the body required for this increase of agency. But we don't have good posture in language. I think also like the very fact, and Kate brought this up, like that there's like people almost now deterministically have to use the word fascist. Like it's almost like they have to. Like they have no freedom. Like you're forced to use the word. So now what's happening is everyone's using the word all the time, and it has no meaning. But the very forceful use of the word fascist that you see constantly is a reflection of determinism and a lack of consciousness, a lack of awareness. Even if it's an accurate description, that's not the point. The point is this forceful need to use the term that suggests a certain determinism in operation. And in order to resist that, you would have to have the energy to fight that. The other thing I was going to say, if we take seriously this notion of Gurdjieff, as I understand it, and that on this idea that the energy has to keep moving, right? So what ends up happening is if you present, hey, what Erica did was beautiful, what people are doing is saying, no, keep your energy. I don't want it. Keep it to yourself, right? So what ends up happening is it gets enclosed, and they're enclosed too. That leads to a certain explosion. The question really should be, very often and then I'll pass it for Michael, Jochen, and then Kashir, is instead of asking right or wrong, you need to focus on, am I receiving or denying? Am I receiving or denying? But you can only do that if you have good posture. Because the only way, this is the issue, in a society of people who don't have good posture, receive means agree. There's no possibility of receiving and not agreeing because they're not flexible enough. But if you have good posture, I can receive and then send it back to you and not accept the position, right? Because I'm able to move with it. In a world without good posture, for me to receive your perspective on Kirk or whoever, because I am not flexible, results in me having to take the position. I take it and I'm like, well, I think that's fascism, so I can't do that. So the only option is not to receive at all. So I put it back on you. But of course, that leads to making an explosion. So the more you were speaking, I'm thinking of this idea of we don't have good posture in our minds, in our dialogues, right? We're not able to move every position, and as a result, the energy gets trapped. But I will pass it to Michael, Mr. Jochen Kusher. Michael, please.
Yeah, I wanted to bring in two things. One is a set of physical practices that I've engaged in that really connect with this kind of flexibility of both body and mind, and then share another one that a friend of mine is involved in. Seth, I'm really curious to hear your, and Daniel, everybody, but you know, as professional body workers, really interested to hear your thoughts on it. So the grad school that I go to, that's a grad school for counseling psychology. It was founded, one of the co-founders of the school, it used to be called the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. Now it's called Sophia University. He was a black belt in Aikido. And so since the founding of the school, they've had a mandatory 3-part Aikido class that all students have had to take. And so we participated in that in our in-person intensive last year. And it was so fascinating in so many ways. The first thing that they had us do was practice our there's a specific Japanese word for it, but it's like the ready stance essentially before you engage. And there's like 4 or 5 steps that you have to go through in order to, you know, to be able to engage in Aikido. And I think the first is rootedness. So really feeling a grounding through, you know, your feet, through your body. And it's kind of like a runner stance in a way. So you have usually your dominant foot in front of your non-dominant foot, but you can go either way. And so, you know, you have this like light bend in your knees, and you really kind of just want to feel this connection to the ground, up this kind of sturdiness. And then the second is center. And so what she would do is she would have us like way kind of forward and back, and then kind of progressively like decrease our sway until we kind of found like where our natural center was. And then we would extend ki, which is energy. So we would kind of like raise one of our arms, and we would kind of feel the energy. Like she said, like you should be able to feel the energy like beyond the ends of your fingers. Like your kind of like energetic center should extend like a foot beyond you. And at which point we kind of thought, all right, this lady's kind of a little nuts, because none of us could feel that at that time. But we progressively got to that stage. But I say all that to say, one of the really interesting things that all of us struggled with in the beginning was, so she would come around like once we thought like we got our kind of stance, you know, right, and she would like kind of push us like on our shoulders, and like everyone would fall, like, or you know, not fall completely, but like everyone would lose balance. And so then we course corrected, and then we like got really like rigid. And then she was like, she kind of did like a kind of side like splash, and like none of us could get out of the way quick enough because we were so rigid and rooted we couldn't move. And so it was like a whole like day and a half of us figuring out like how do we be strong enough in our kind of own integrity. You know, it's like the Muhammad Ali line, like float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, like you know, kind of that kind of like holding that tension. And it was just really interesting. And one of the kind of lessons we would do is we would be in our stance, and then we would kind of do this like kind of bi-directional exercise where we would shift 180 degrees, turn around, and then move our back foot 90 degrees. And so now we're like here, and then we would spin around and we would kind of keep going like that. And that was just like a very, and she would have us like notice like, what are you noticing psychologically as you're kind of moving in this like flexible way? And it was really interesting to notice like how much more cognitively like flexible I was and spacious I felt. So that just kind of connecting to this like flexibility of thought, posture kind of idea. The other thing I wanted to bring in is I have a good friend who has been taking these workshops through the Bodynamic Institute. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that. It started in Greece, and it's kind of still mainly in Europe. Like there's only 3 certified bodynamic therapists in the US. But essentially it was created by this woman, legacy of World War II. She was a therapist working with a lot of people dealing with PTSD and their subsequent, children. And she was noticing that there was this like psychosomatic connection in the symptoms that they were experiencing. And so she created this model of therapy that is really quite unique in how much it synthesizes like somatic somatic developmental stages and understanding psychotherapeutic symptoms through the body, but then also like heavily inspired by people like Winnicott, other Piaget, like other child developmental psychologists. And so kind of their big model is based on these 7 character structures that they talk about like throughout the lifespan. So you start when you're born with the existence character structure, like you are just coming into life, and you are there really hasn't been an ego structure yet, but you're just figuring out like, oh, I am a person in the world. I exist. And then I think at around 6 months, the need structure comes online, which is like you start kind of tugging at the mom's shirt when you're hungry. You start crying when you're upset or thirsty or hungry. You start expressing like, oh, I have needs and I need to get them met. And then I think it goes will, autonomy. I can't remember what the other ones were, but one of the interesting things that he was sharing with me was, a lot of people in kind of the healing space, the therapy space, talk about like reclaiming, in parts work, you talk about like reconnecting with exiled parts. And there's kind of this idea that like there are parts of us that we once had that we at some point lost, and kind of the goal is to reclaim them. And what's different about this modality is they realize that for a lot of people, that is not an effective paradigm, because rather than having things and then losing them, a lot of people just never had. They were never allowed to express their own needs. They were never allowed to express their own autonomy without fear of retribution. So it's like trying to get someone to remember what it was like to ride a bike, and they've never learned how to ride a bike. And so she has this example where with I think it's with like the need structure, she'll have people reach out their hand kind of in a similar way to like extend ki, but it'll be with the scenario of like reaching out for help. And there's very specific muscles that engage when you are like open and vulnerable in reaching out for help, as opposed to like fearing that help not being received, or kind of this like stiffness and awkwardness if you've like never done that. And so he told me the story of like this veteran who was, chiseled guy, like jacked, physical specimen, who when he went to go do this, like she could clearly tell, like I don't know if it was like something in his shoulders or something, was just super offline, super tight. And she got in a conversation with him about that, and she found out all this childhood trauma that he had. So it's just this really interesting kind of connection between the latent wisdom that's in the body, that for so many people was, it's kind of less of like excavating the mind to tap into it, and it's more like teaching I think we've talked about it, the net, like being like biologically an adult but like spiritually an infant. Like it's kind of like that idea of like training the body to like express needs, which if you're raised by healthy parents, you learned that very young. But if you haven't, it's something that you literally have to feel again before the kind of the cognitive and intellectual understanding of like why that's important even can start to like really start to formalize. Like it kind of has like the primacy of the body, I think is really important to consider. It's just I've been kind of fascinated listening to him and kind of thinking about like my own life and things that I've struggled with kind of all of those different character structures, and how you can kind of be made to feel like, oh, that's something you should have already figured out how to do. And then you kind of try and solve it through like an intellectual, like cognitive exercise of like, oh, I just need more willpower. Like I just need to like get out there more and like, ask that girl out or whatever. Or, like just mend my relationship with my mom. Like just do it. And it's like, it's often like the brain can't get to where the body hasn't first gotten to. It seems like it's something I'm realizing in real time. So this has been really great.
That's fantastic. I will give it to Joaquin because now I'm thinking it's like just have more, just think yourself into like better lung capacity. Think yourself into running 4 minute miles, right? Like it's very interesting. We wouldn't do that, and yet we do that with traumas. We do that with other things. We do not think that the body thinks, but the body is part of thinking. And it's part of it all. So I love that. I meant to also mention when you talked about Mizuzaki, I mean, hanging out in the garden, listening to Joe Hisashi music, I mean, that is the way. So, the Tunnel of Wind, I'm all about it. Nothing wrong with that. So I also am thinking, as my computer looks like it's shutting down, I can't tell, is that there is also something very interesting about, yep, it shut down. All of this could be recorded. I'm singing, yep, you can still hear me. That's fantastic. So you didn't miss on the singing. It got windy. Do you know how bad wind is for the internet? It's a mess when it gets windy. I mean, it's terrible. But hopefully that will change. So, but anyway, I was going to say Joe Hisashi in the garden. It's really great. It's funny to also think about how good posture in the brain reflects the body. And so we're sitting at our desk, sedentary society, bad posture in the body, exposed to the internet where we need good posture, quote unquote, more than ever before. So that's a wonderful recipe. So, so it would almost seem like a lot. It's like the issue is using the internet without good physical posture. Because then you're not going to have good mental posture, and that these things actually inform one another. So how can you use the internet without losing your body, right? These things really go together. I'm also, should note, I've been thanking Nicholas Luhmann, Cybernetics with Gurdjieff after speaking with Echomancer, thanks to Mr. Jochen. I've really enjoyed that. I think Gurdjieff and cybernetic thinking goes together very well. The last thing I was going to say quickly, what you're saying about the body, it makes me think of what Lucas talked about on these practices of being fully conscious of the body. Like we're very rarely fully conscious. Be conscious of your ankle, be conscious of your hand. Like to actually feel all of this, we very rarely do. And if there's something about learning how to be fully present in the body that's actually necessary for having the flexibility of mind or the good posture to handle a Kirk situation, these things all go together, actually. And also that idea of remembering how to ride a bike when you never learned. I kind of love that. It makes me think why Plato argued for the eternity of the soul, right? Like the ability to remember something that you never did would seem only possible if there's some sort of eternity of the soul or some sort of metaphysical interconnectedness of all of being in a manner where you can remember things that you yourself never did. Now, that's, of course, a lot, but I like saying a lot. Mr. Jock, it is good to see you, sir. It is good to see you.
Good to see everybody. I mean, I think you know what's funny? The first thing I was picking up, just again from my notes, was, and I've been thinking about this recently too, it's the relationship of anxiety and hope. Aquinas talks about they're both related to our perception of the future. It's the soul's disposition, orientation to the future. Both related to what's arduous, what's difficult. There's a difficulty or a challenge, but attainable. And the difference is really one is an object of desire of goodness, and one is an object of pain, of fear, right, of harm of some kind. And I just think about that because I think a lot of reality of how we relate with one another is, I'm not that surprised we don't think with our bodies, because we have such anxiety of the excess. So in the anxiety of the excess, when we have discourse with one another, I'm not surprised, especially with Seth saying about the kind of, again, I missed some context about it, but it sounds like he was in a discourse where he was making a count of, hey, well, let's consider the other side. I was having a private conversation with Javier on the same point. Let's take the benefit of the doubt of the other side. Maybe a position of charity, but under certain discourses of the moral domain, absolutely not. You cannot do this. There is a kind of, by you accepting the other side even has any validity at all, there's some core principle you're violating. There's a principle at play that the acknowledgement of this other side's legitimacy under any ground is threatening to the social order, and the anxiety that get explode to that. That's the reason why we talk about this kind of rigidity. Listen, people get rigid because you want stability. You want a fixed, contained logic that gives you safety. And this is a very natural human instinct. You want safety because you have anxiety, because you have this fear and anxiety, right, of recognition of some kind of excess from the future that's going to come get you. It's actually the reason why a lot of times we can think about eros is the interplay. Eros is the kind of interplay of boundaries of the subject of the self with the other. This is generally what eros is playing with, or kind of showing a fluidity in this fact. It's great power, but it's great danger, because in that excess of subjectivity or the relation of the self to the other, one can basically break all relationships, all understanding, all boundaries. And this is what the account of logos is supposed to give you. An account of logos with the fixity of our relationships of account, where I am a son, I'm a father, I'm a husband, etc. You're in this political discourse, you're the progressive, you're a conservative. You have these fixities that contain the excess. And if you bring up, and Kate brought in the chat this idea of fascism is basically the modern day version of a witch from the Middle Ages, right? And under social environments of great anxiety, we have these moral terms that get used for anyone that breaks or has any time discontinuity of the moral order. And it's meant to be a moral claim statement to say, nope, you're a destabilizing force. We got to pin this on you. And any account you give is not legitimate. I just think about that because this idea of what I'm hearing from Michael about, the Aikido, boxing would do all this. We talk about all this all the time: rootedness, centeredness, gesture, meaning there's an extension of the self, an extension of the body. With the right posture, you actually have the capacity to do that. What I'm saying is boxers actually gain when you actually learn there's a radius of attack. So even though there's a radius that you can strike and be stricken, and it varies, by the way. It's not fixed. It's based on your opponent and you. There's a certain prudential relationship. This is why in boxing we talk about a feeling round. A test round is when you're usually exchanging with jabs. You're purposely not just on to going directly to full offensive attack all the way, because you need to get diagnostics on the ranges and dispositions of the person, of your opponent and yourself in the space. So when I hear this Aikido talk about gesture, what's the extension of the gesture? This is in my mind, this is the first round of a sparring session related to boxing. you're using the jab to get a sense of the spacing between you and your opponent. I'm just saying this because the kind of circle back with the original point I was making about anxiety and hope. The allowance of a space like this is because we have a certain disposition of hope. We do. We enter this space with uncertainty of what's going to be the discourse, but the anxieties that would normally trigger have been dissipated. So as a result, we're in a state of hope. We're actually kind of in this kind of creative state of we're not certain what's going to happen, but a possibility is in front of us. And it will be arduous. We have to do some work here. You do notice that actually everyone here has to do work. We have to write notes, we have to pay attention, we have to riff off each other. This is not a passive lecture where we're just taking in information in that social relationship of student professor or whatever. I just think that's very important, that there's a quality about that actually is very particular. I think also a big note too, this is my favorite topic, I keep coming back to it. We're in a kind of state of mythos with each other. Our accounts are a mythos. What I'm saying is we're not so fixed of logos of here's the account, and this actually relates to especially moral statements or claims. So in our discourse with one another in a social relationship order, there are logos accounts of stability that have a fang of necessity to it. This must be the case. If this is not the case, this account is not true. I say this because origin stories of how the universe got made, like no one's dying for Zeus, but people did die for Zeus at one point. You see, like that's what I meant by mythos versus a logos account. There's that fang of necessity that kind of grabs on people, and it makes us forget. We constantly do this, and then we see these things that were once logos become mythos and just forget. They had the force of necessity behind to it. And I'm going to circle back on this last part about this. So in this space of the net, where we have this kind of mythos eros play of discourse that's occurring, that we're not fixed in location, we're not trying to stabilize. We're kind of in a sense of safe. We actually have enough safety that we can do the kind of explorational adventure together. I'm saying this actually about virtue, because my course on health is happening right now. And actually, we just talked about courage. And this is a huge part because you know what it comes down to? This posture and relationship to it. When encountering anxiety, what kind of social relationships do we have with people requires courage. What I'm saying is, to actually have a candid conversation with someone that maintains the relationship, yet exposes something legitimate about at the same time, takes courage. And that gives you an opportunity. The reason why, but here's the thing, you can choose to not engage and just let things stay copacetic, just stay at kind of the social relationship level of a certain kind of social relation. But if we go into the courage of a candid discourse, it puts a risk up because now we're destabilizing the relationship where it's potentially destabilizing. But why would you do that? Why not? If you want, because there's something more than just safety. That's why this is an arduous good. There's something arduous at play, that there's a new possibility of a relationship and courage. When you have courage, you have a possibility of engagement discourse with another. You can enter into a new relationship as a result of it. Now it could fail. That's the key. That it has to be. There's a risk at play. So thus courage also has a quality of risk. You're risking the relationship. It could be as actually a big note what Michael's saying. Again, I heard him make a comment about, the typical example, go ask a girl out. That's a risk. It's a huge risk. Or like if you had a relationship, if you knew someone and wanted to move the relationship to a romantic one, that's taking a risk, right? And that's something at play here. I think it's quite important because it's very much a disposition about fear and hope. There's a kind of relationship to the future good. Our relationship to time. It's a very important aspect of this. I'll just close on this note because the ordering of one's life and our habituations and virtue, because there are two orders. There's the order in, I'm quoting from Aquinas, coming generation and matter and actuality and form. There are two kinds of order. Everyone thinks there's one form. This is part of the why people get tripped up with the Augustine argument of beauty by order, is because there's actually two kinds of order. There's not just one. The ordering of matter and physical objects is slightly different, which is usually of technes, which is very different than phronesis, of wisdom, of practical wisdom, because that's of habituation over time. If I enter into a kind of condition where I'm in a creative state of entering the net and working with all you and having a kind of geopathic play with discourse, or not the fixity of logos of a kind of ritualized symbolic relationship of titles and position, this creates a position. I get this position of hope, right? I have the virtue of hope because I'm in disposition of a good that's arduous and difficult, but worth but attainable by conditioning my body in a certain way by showing up, versus basically habituating the vice of fear, right? Basically of shooing away from the arduous good because you think an evil's coming that's going to get you. So I think this is a very subtle detail. There's, again, and I think the whole discourse with Kirk is a great example of that. It's a politicized speech of witch hunts, of the symbolic form, moral force of fascists getting thrown around like crazy. And it basically locks up discourse. How could you possibly have anything that's geopedic? You can't. Thus, people enter into the algorithmic spaces. I'll close on this. I actually meant to bring this up I want to bring this up to the group. Now, I saw this discussion brought me back to a point I wanted to bring up. So I don't know if you guys ever saw this on Twitter, but there's a progressive named Destiny who posted a retweet commentating on Erica Kirk's speech on forgiveness. This I think is really important. And in his rhetorical move of the retweet, he posts a dubbed translation of Hitler talking about the necessity of forgiveness. We must forgive these people. And he's giving certain race groups and all that. I guess there's two notes. One, I don't even know that's even real. I don't know if that was an AI if that was a troll deepfake or whatnot, but either way, either it was real or not, that rhetorical move of Erica Kirk's discussion of forgiveness, the counter side of the political discourse saying, no, this is now we're going to now rhetorically associate this with Hitler. I was talking with Javier and Luber about this. This is incredibly, we're talking about feigning necessity here, rhetorically. We're saying, nope, forgiveness is this rhetorical of forgiveness. The language of forgiveness and discussion about it is one of Hitler. That's the move that's happening there. So I don't know what to make with that. That's immensely, just powerful in terms of what are we to do with this? What is this happening? We're just and especially if this really was a deep fake. If this was a deep fake, especially this again, I don't know this, but I'm just saying, I'm just hypothetical. If that Hitler dub into English was a deep fake, then this is algorithmic thinking, algorithm systems and discourse just accelerating. Now we're using the phantasms of the AI to self-justify a political position in a rhetorical structure argument online. It's basically the worst possible scenario. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So a bunch of but I'll give it to Kassir and Javier, and then if anyone, I do have a wedding, but this is all incredibly important. To say something very broad, very quickly. Courage, so we have a cybernetic system, alluding to Echomancer, Lumen, etc., so forth, the internet. A cybernetic system without courage will become auto-cannibalistic. And the only way to develop courage is through the good posture of the mind, of which it requires the good posture of the body. And all of that then affords the possibility of an experience of resonance or geopedia, as Mr. Kassir has talked about, of which then makes it rational to do all of that work. Because you've experienced it, you know it is a possibility in the world, therefore you can have hope in those works, right? So that's a very broad claim, but basically I do think courage is a big part of it, and a lot of the problem is we have the internet without courage. Well, you put that together, it's going to be auto-cannibalistic, but the issue is, people are not practically going to do the work of developing courage if they've never had the strike of beauty, if they've never had the mystical, if they've never had the resonance of the geoperic, because why? Why do it? Why do that work, right? They have to have a quality of experience of which makes them go, oh, that's why. I can't quantify it, but it's very concrete. You can't quantify resonance, but it's friggin' concrete when you get it. You can't quantify a good hip-hop cipher, but it's real concrete when you get it. And when people have that, then they're going to do the work of the courage, of which in a cybernetic system that the internet is, without that, the energy is going to get stuck, as Luke warns about with Gurdjieff, and then it's going to blow up. And that's what we're saying. And ladies and gentlemen, if you destroy forgiveness, that's cybernetic system's doomed, because forgiveness is the only way to keep the energy flowing before it gets captured in some vector of the good, as Mr. Jochen talks about. And once it gets captured in some vector of the good, game over. Two quick things. Even if you think the Trump administration is fascist, they actually benefit from people only being able to use the word fascist, because that is a loss of oration. Like when everyone can only use fascist, you lost the ability to speak and compel action. So actually another consequence of actually a society that can only use terms like fascist or description is that actually benefits those people if they are real fascists, because it's strong oration that actually moves the people to act, not a description. But description feels like oration, so people don't train that muscle. They lose the ability of rhetoric, as Michael and I was talking about, and it doesn't make a difference. So here's the great irony. The use of the term fascist not only loses its sting, but actually benefits the very people, in my opinion, of whom you are using that description of, because it is not a use of language in the elevated manner that can actually compel people to political motion, right? So it's the worst of all worlds. And then, of course, it is when a society loses the ability to orate, personality and subjectivity itself shrinks. And if you have less personality, that would perhaps translate to less character. And if you have less character, do you really think you're going to be able to stand up to the fascists? Probably not. Also, what I will say lastly is one of the great problems is it's in Belonging Again, Part 1. It's called The Problem of Equality and Its Immoral Limits on the idea of equality. And this is what's going on here. We do not think it's wrong to put someone in jail who, say, commits murder, for example. Why? Isn't that a violation of equality? Because they did something immoral. Therefore, that's the limit of equality. Who we extend equality to is always relative to what we consider ethical, okay? So what ends up happening is if you define the conservatives as immoral or the liberals as immoral, the denying them of equality is not a denial of equality, right? You're all about, it's no different than what happens in racism, where if I treat a minority as a slave or something, well, they're not human, therefore I'm not doing anything wrong, therefore I'm moral. Like all denials of equality have a self-concealing mechanism, and that's where you're saying everyone gets trapped in their logic. Because if, say, the minority who I am enslaving is not human, well, then I've done nothing wrong. So I'm still a moral person. And that's how these great evils in history perpetuate, because equality is always bound to its vector of the good, and therefore denying equality outside that vector of the good is not denying anything. And so everyone gets trapped in their ethics, and the only thing to perhaps possibly kind of somewhat, hopefully, let's all pray, break through those vectors of the good is going to be forgiveness. And if you say that's what Hitler did, game over, baby. But here's the issue. You can absolutely use forgiveness. I can, even if it is a deep fake, it's not actually impossible to use forgiveness to mobilize your people against the other side. That's why forgiveness has to be in the body, dang it. It can't be a mental thing. You have to feel it throughout your entire being. Otherwise, I'm using it as an abstract philosophical concept to take a moral high ground to take advantage of people. Forgiveness is a matter of the body. It is in you. If you say, I forgive them, but you don't ever go talk to them, or every time you're around them, you're angry, you don't actually forgive them. It's just a philosophical notion that can be gamified, right? So part of the issue is I'm of the opinion, because I'm obsessed with the topic of forgiveness these days, I don't think we've actually thought forgiveness. We don't know what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is a mode of being. It is not merely a single act of I forgive them. It is a mode of being. I think forgiveness is primarily the willingness to rehumanize. It is not where you never put up boundaries. It's not where you never say, I can't interact with them, but you're always willing to rehumanize them, right? And that has to be in the body, right? Forgiveness is not simply saying, I forgive them, ergo it's okay what they did. Because if you do that and never talk to them or continue to treat them like a monster, or et cetera, so forth, then it's just a tactic, right? It has to be a willingness to ever rehumanize. And this would be my point. In a cybernetic system like the internet, in an interconnected internet, if the average person is not willing to humanize, to rehumanize, then it is only a matter of time before something happens in the system that begins breaking it apart into vectors of the good that then become isolated. In that isolation, energy, quote unquote, gets captured, or emotion gets captured, and that blows up. And when that blows up, that sends shockwaves through the rest of the system that can destabilize everyone else, which if they don't have the training in the body or the anti-fragility to handle that disruption, the whole thing will fall apart. So forgiveness is really important, and Luke and I talked about this to keep things moving. And when you start saying, well, forgiveness is what Hitler did to take advantage, you are on the verge of pandemonium at that point, which is the, castle in hell for Milton. So, but let me give it to Jacob Kashir. Kashir, it is so good to see you on this fine day. I hope you're doing well.
It is a fine day, isn't it? It's great
Yes,
to
sir.
see all of you. Hello, friends. Hello, new faces and philosophers. Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that last note, Daniel, I don't think Hitler was in the business of forgiveness. So representing Hitler as in the business of forgiveness is like the pure antithesis of truth and what people talk about as Antichrist. Now, I'm not super into the whole, I'm not in that wing of Christian revival, but that seems like an appropriate use of the term. Yeah, I was moved deeply by that talk, and I watched the whole ceremony, and there was a whole mix of things in there, and I was thinking of you, Daniel, whilst I was watching it, because it seemed to me to be the perfect exposition of the profound world transforming value contained within Christianity, and also the ever-present danger contained within it, and both were on display in the same 2 hours. And so within Erica Kirk's speech, you see the profound power that is the cycle breaking move. Um, and whilst I will also point to the shadow of the response on the right, the fact that there are not tens or hundreds of towns and cities rioting and burning in the US in the wake of this event is somehow consequentially related to forgiveness and that ethos. With that being said, you also had Stephen Miller go up, and he gives me snaky vibes and has for a long time, and that speech, you could more meaningfully explore the relationship between that and the kind of narrative structure that fascism operates under, of basically we are the good and they are the evil. So how do we deal with it? I want to first of all commend Seth's courage, and I don't know whether it was warriorship or beginner's mind, but willingness to throw that stuff out there is encouraging to me. I think it's really important. Um, I have a number of essays I'm sitting on which touch on issues which do the same thing, and I think it's really, really important that we have relationships in which we can do the dirty work of mediation around these issues. Like there is a lot of mediation to be done. The condition to be able to do that is love and a high degree of resonance, such that you can get to the point of like, fuck, we are not in the same world at all. We may have like completely competing value structures when it comes to the political dimension, but there's still some abiding sense of brother or kin that underlies that. And then you can kind of go right, and this is what I've been doing during the Kirk thing with a close friend and collaborator, like going right out to the limit of like, fuck, this is really stretching our relationship. And then we can kind of like bring it back down. But in doing that, I do get to see like just how funneled I also have the capacity to be through that reflection. And so that feels really important. Um, and that's not even loving your enemies. That's loving your friends. It's like, do I love my friends who happen to be on the other side enough to be able to go there? And then loving your enemies is something that I think is, if we don't understand forgiveness, we definitely don't understand loving your enemies. And the more I meditate on it, the more I realize that there are whole swathes of people that I am not yet capable of loving. So, work to be done there. Yeah. Okay. I want to touch on the point around posture, I think is really, really pertinent, and also the idea of limits. I've been reading Byung-Chul Han. He's fantastic. I'm sure many of you already have. But that idea of excess positivity and the necessity of recreating limits seems to be a really important condition of engaging with any of this. Structural limits, like within the day, and within the week. I actually took a fast, which I've never done like that intentionally, but I took like a 3-4 day complete social media fast after the week of the Kirk killing, because it just blew out my entire circuitry. My fuse board was blown out. It was way too much to process. And having spaces of leisure and contemplation and all of that feels really important. somewhere in this also there's something around ayahuasca ceremonies that I'm trying to connect, and it's still quite nascent, but within the context of ayahuasca ceremonies and going into those kind of visionary journeys, there's a significant emphasis on posture. And you're in this posture that's kind of like propped up on a mat. You're not completely sitting upright, but you're also not lying down. You're kind of like in a relaxed uprightness. And they stress, like the maestros stress this a lot. Like if you just let yourself slide down, the visions are going to wash over you. And I see a parallel between being in these kind of visionary spaces with psychedelics, with plant medicine, and being in the visionary entrancement and schizophrenia of the internet in our age. And so there's something in there for me of like, how do I maintain the posture? And there are some nights in ceremony where it feels like you can't stop. You just keep slipping down, and you have to keep coming up, and then you slip down and you come up, and you do it over and over and over again. But the idea is that there's some posture where you can maintain that meditative second awareness, or you can maintain that kind of prayerful connection to something greater than whatever is being presented to you, however intense, however like dark or confusing the vision before you might be. And that feels like more or less what's asked of us in relation to the intense fuckery before us. And then, of course, the other feature of the ayahuasca ceremony is the music is absolutely essential. Like you are being guided through the experience by the ikaro that's being sung by the shaman. And so like that is what allows you to have coherence as you move through all of these different terrains of mind and body and emotion. And it makes me think, okay, well then what is the music that we should like, what is the music that we're listening to? And in a sense, we are all we're having to create that music together in order to create some of that. Like we have to kind of collectively create the ikaro that carries us through the collective trip that we're on. So that brings us back to resonance, I suppose. Resonance is really important here. And yeah, I think to conclude, resonance is very important. And I am currently thinking about where does the resonant man meet the Renaissance man as well? And so like, how can we be like present to what's here, but also somewhere back in ancient Rome or Greece or somewhere in philosophy and theology simultaneously in a way that gives us that perspectival balance. And I'll leave it at that.
Magnificent. I'll give it to Javier and Michael. And then if anyone has final thing to last, I do have to go this evening in a bit to put out chairs for the wedding, but I very much appreciate that. I think thinking the resonance, so for me, thinking resonance and Renaissance together has something to do with taking seriously the internet, the social coordination mechanism, the cybernetic system that is being developed in a Lumen sense, which requires thinking like what Gurdjieff is putting forth, as Luke has talked about and written about on his blog. And there's something about putting those things together, which will require the strike of beauty to actually inspire us to have the courage to thus develop the drive so that we can continue moving, having flexibility in the system so it doesn't become auto-cannibalistic, of which we need to do, or we're in trouble. And I really like what you were also saying about music as coherence, because as we have lost the music of being, what ends up happening is we try to make coherence based on logic. We try to bind us together by logic, right? But the only way to pluralistically have coherence is something more like music, actually. And you see that in the hip hop cipher. You see that in, well, hopefully here. And you see that, but people, when you have a certain openness, you're able to actually be held together by a certain musicality that occurs, right? It makes me think of Chronicles of Narnia, where you're singing reality into being. The loss of music, when we lose music, we try to replace it with logic. And since the true isn't the rational, that logic tends to end at a vector of the good. And when we end up in a vector of the good, we're cut off from the other, and then we eat ourselves for sustenance, which is very problematic. So I very much like what you were saying there. I will pause and give it, though, to Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera, I hope you are well today, sir.
Hello.
Hey there, Rivera. How you doing?
Hey, hey. Good to see you guys. Man, I'm so happy you guys brought up the Erica Kirk thing, because I watched a really good video. I think it's like a good case study It has Abba preach. It has Abba. He's usually on the YouTube channel Abba and Preach. But Abba did a debate with a Republican person. I forgot his name. But the video is really telling because it tells me how the discourse plays out between two people that represent the sides that aren't necessarily consider themselves like what's the word, like they're not pundits, they're not political pundits per se. What I noticed in the conversation was Abba said something really great towards the end of the video was Erica Kirk saying forgiveness was really impressionable upon him, and he's like generally pretty left. And he said that was a beautiful moment for him, which I thought was such an interesting use of terms. He said that was a really beautiful moment. He goes, unfortunately, it was kind of covered over quickly, right? Trump says what he says. Naba's talking about how disrespectful it was to almost get up there and go against the message that Erica Kirk was trying to portray, right? Because there's a certain level of disrespect of now it's very clear who's pushing political agendas, right? Now it's very clear, right? Now there has been some doubt about people posing whether Erica Kirk had other motives. I mean, honestly, I take the position as of right now. I take the position from psychoanalysis. We should take the letter of the word. The letter of the word is that this is what Erica said. Right? This is what she said. Now we can say why did we say it, and we can go into the psychoanalytic conversation about why was it said. But it was said, and it was a very particular word that came with what we are experiencing. And to me, this is why I think it's less about intentions. What we are seeing in real time, as I shared with Jock in that Twitter thing about the Hitler and the forgiveness thing, is what we're seeing in real time is how people associate forgiveness. What people link to forgiveness. And it's quite telling. And that's why it's really, really concerning. But I really love this conversation about the body and the posturing, and something that I've been struggling with as a listener, because I've been trying to think about, and we brought up music, right? See you later, Luber. We've been bringing up this idea of music, and I've been thinking, listening is interesting because I almost want to say we need a practice of psychoanalytic listening, but it can't just be purely psychoanalytic listening, and I mean mainly Lacanian listening, because a lot of Lacanian listening is they're not really talking. Most of the time, they're not going to be talking to you, but they will point out words to you that you're using. But what I find interesting about psychoanalytic listening is that they're not invested. They try to push themselves aside, so they don't listen in relation to themselves, right? So if I hear someone speaking, I don't think how it relates to me, which I think is a useful tool, because in some sense, listening is by being the most present that one can be. But here's the trick, though. That's a little tricky with personal relationships, because you still have to, at the end of the conversation, at the end of the person speaking, they're going to ask you, they're going to provoke you into saying, what do you think? What is your take? What is your understanding of this? And I realize, like, I don't think we've figured out this dance with listening of being fully present to the word, like as if it's music, right? I'm not thinking how it relates to me. I'm not thinking about how it affects me, because that's the problem with interpersonal relationships, right? Like the moment you hear your girlfriend say something and you're like, wow, that kind of offends me, she's already said probably 2 sentences in between there, while you going like, yeah, that kind of offended me, actually. That really pisses me off. And then you start thinking about what you're going to say in response to that kind of comment. So this is what we would call being stuck or trapped in the imaginary from a Lacanian point of view. And I always find it interesting that we should generally try to avoid that. But I also think, and this is the problem, right? None of us are therapists. So we still got to give some type of, that talking has some stakes to it. So yeah, I've just been trying to figure out, like, and I can only conclude that listening requires some type of dancing with this juggling between I'm pushing myself out of the way to listen, and then I have to put myself back on stake to give what I think. And I haven't found a better solution to that problem. Because it still comes with some type of risk, because just because maybe I can mitigate my defensiveness, I can't necessarily mitigate my partner or my discussion partner's defensiveness. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say.
I think that's magnificent. And forgive me, everyone, I will have to run to do these chairs, but thank you all for being here. And Luke, getting up at 5 in the morning to be here is sainthood. I need to send you a little Lego saint model. And I've really appreciated this conversation. Just to close, on what you were saying there, Mr. Rivera, it makes me think Guy Senstock will emphasize listening and how we haven't listened, the difference between listening and hearing, which, by the way, is a distinction that philosophers make that increase agency, because if listening and hearing are just similes, then whatever deterministic gutter or track that has you in will just carry you along. But once you say, wait, I heard you, but I wasn't listening. Isn't it funny how just doing that sentence creates a certain agency in it? It creates a certain new horizon of possibility, which again, I think speaks to why the work of words in terms of literature, religion, philosophy is the fate of the human being is strongly tied to, and the way and possibilities of using words are strongly tied to our bodies and how we're able to carry ourselves in the world. Because to put it one way, if I was not able to perceive the color blue, then you sure as heck ain't going to talk about it, are you? And so your perception and what you're able to experience impacts what you're going to try to talk about and could talk about. Therefore, the limits of my language are the limits of my world, but the limits of my language are the limits of my body, of which are in the world. So you get this sort of feedback loop that's going on that I think is incredibly important. And if you don't do that, somewhere the energy will be captured and you're in big, big trouble. There is a massive difference. Most people listening, one should listen to hear your girdle point, not listen to tell where their map's not like yours and therefore they're an enemy. That's what most people do in a conversation. I am listening for when your map fails, when your map is wrong and unlike mine, versus listening to you to find my girdle point, my point where the map isn't the territory, so that I am actually forced to go beyond my internal consistency. Listening doesn't begin until you, do it from a posture of the map is not the territory. And you literally can say you're doing that. You can literally say you're doing that, but you can't in your body be doing that unless you're feeling anxiety, which requires courage. And that's only going to be happening if you're listening to hear your girdle point. And then speaking from that girdle point as a possible bridge to you. Because once I kind of speak from the point where my map is not the territory, that can be a connection point, because that is a lack, that is not nothing, that we then have in common. And this changes a lot. The topic of forgiveness is, for me, the hard problem of forgiveness is the hard problem of the social. We talk about the hard problem of consciousness. Indeed, for the individual that could be, and if we meet it in a Gurdjieffian sense, then it comes together. But forgiveness is the hard problem of forgiveness will be upon which we determine if we're doomed or not. And it is a little hint. It is not very natural for people to see what Erica did, Miss Kirk, and go, that's good. What do they tend to do? That was beautiful. Isn't Isn't that funny? Almost as if there's a kind of deep intuition that the only way to deal with the problem of conflicting vectors of the good, as Mr. Jockin stresses, is going to deal with beauty. And a suggestion that the matter of forgiveness is not reducible to the language of the good, but it is actually rising above it. Because I do think a way I increasingly think about it is that forgiveness is when you give back the knowledge of good and evil to the tree. Because we got it early. Because what you're doing in forgiveness is saying the knowledge of good and evil is, you're suspending it. You're saying, I don't know what's good and evil, so I'm going to forgive, actually. And when you give that back, then we might have a glimpse of a certain return to a particular kind of paradise. But it's quite a death to self to be willing to give up your idea of good and evil, your knowledge of good and evil, perhaps to liberate the energy of the body. But everyone, it's been a delight. I'm going to go unfold chairs. I hope you have a wonderful day, and all the best to you. Thank you so much.